Welcome back, my loves. I'm so glad you're here, because today's story is one of those that stays with you, the kind you're still thinking about when you're trying to fall asleep 3 nights from now. This is Lay's story. She's a woman who did everything right, or at least, everything that's supposed to feel right. She left. She packed 2 suitcases, drove 14 hours, and moved to a city where nobody knew her name, her past, or the reason her hands shook every time she heard a certain kind of laugh. She moved cities to forget. She thought distance was the same thing as healing. She was wrong. Because the first time she sat down across from her new therapist, a woman she had never met, a woman who was supposed to help her finally move on, Lays looked into those eyes and felt the floor disappear beneath her feet. Same voice, same eyes, same impossible pull. A story full of tension, silence, and that feeling you recognize before you can name it. Stay with me until the end. I promise it's worth every second. Are you ready? Then let's begin. I moved to Portland in November. Not because I had always wanted to live in Portland. I hadn't. Not because I had a job waiting, or a friend with a spare room, or any reason that would make sense if I said it out loud. I moved to Portland because it was the farthest city I could find on a map that still had a direct flight, and because the idea of changing my zip code felt like the closest thing to changing who I was that I could manage without actually becoming a different person. I know how that sounds. I packed 2 suitcases and a box of books I never opened, drove to the airport at 5 a.m. so I wouldn't have to explain myself to anyone, and sat in the departure terminal eating a blueberry muffin I didn't taste, staring at the gate number like it was a door to somewhere better. It wasn't. Or maybe it was. I still don't know. What I know is that I sat in seat 14C, put my headphones in before anyone could try to make conversation, and spent the entire flight pretending to sleep while my chest did that thing it had been doing for 3 months. That slow, low ache that isn't quite pain, and isn't quite grief, but sits somewhere between the two like it has nowhere else to go. I was moving to forget her. That was the plan. That was the whole plan. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Her name was Renata. I'm going to say that once, and then I'm going to try very hard not to say it again, because even now, even after everything, even after 14 hours of highway and a new apartment with floors that creak, and a city where nobody knows what my coffee order is, her name still does something to the space behind my sternum that I don't have a good word for in English or in Portuguese. We met at work. That's the simple version. The longer version is that we met in the way people meet when they've been circling each other for months without realizing it. At the edge of someone else's conversation. At the coffee machine on the 4th floor. In the elevator where neither of us pressed the button for the same floor, but somehow we both forgot to press our own floors until the doors had already closed twice. She was my supervisor's supervisor. That detail mattered in the beginning, because it gave me a clean, professional reason to pay attention to her. I was supposed to pay attention to her. I was supposed to know her schedule, her preferences, the specific way she liked the weekly reports formatted. I was supposed to be in the same room as her and feel nothing except the mild professional anxiety of someone who wanted to do their job well. That's what I told myself. That's what I kept telling myself for 6 months. She laughed from somewhere inside her chest. That was the first thing I noticed. Not her eyes. Everyone notices her eyes eventually. But I noticed the laugh first. It was the kind of laugh that didn't perform. It didn't calculate whether the room would find it appropriate. It just happened, full and unhurried, and the first time I heard it from 3 offices away through 2 glass walls, I looked up from my screen without knowing why. I didn't know why. That was the beginning of everything. We weren't friends. We were something more careful than friends. 2 people who noticed things about each other without acknowledging what the noticing meant. She remembered how I took my coffee without being told. I saved the window seat in every meeting we shared, without being asked. She sent me articles she thought I'd find interesting at 10 o'clock at night, and I read them all, always, lying in the dark of my apartment, one hand holding my phone and the other pressed flat against my collarbone like I was checking for something. Nothing happened. That's the part that's hardest to explain to people who weren't there. Nothing happened, and somehow everything happened. And by the time I understood what was building between us, it had already been building so long and so quietly that I couldn't remember what the space between us had felt like before it was full of this unnamed, unspoken, unexploded thing that lived in every pause and every sideways glance and every conversation that ran 15 minutes longer than either of us meant it to. And then something happened. A Tuesday in August. A conference in another city. A dinner that went later than it should have, with wine that I drank more of than I intended to, and a walk back to the hotel that took 40 minutes when it should have taken 12. We walked slowly. We talked about things that weren't work. She told me about her mother, who grew up in a small city in Minas Gerais and never quite got used to the cold. I told her about the time I was 11 and convinced myself I was going to be a marine biologist, and she laughed. That laugh, that chest-first laugh, and said she could see it. She could see it. And at the door to my hotel room, she looked at me for a moment that was 3 seconds too long, and something in her expression shifted, and I felt my entire nervous system catch fire. And then she said goodnight in a voice that was quieter than her normal voice, and walked away down the hall. I stood at my door for 4 minutes. I know it was 4 minutes because I checked my phone twice, and it told me. I didn't sleep that night. And in the morning, we both pretended that nothing had happened, because nothing had happened. Because that's the story we decided to tell, together separately in silence without ever discussing it. And I was so good at telling it that I almost believed it. Almost. I spent the next 3 months being very, very good at almost believing it. And then I couldn't anymore. And then I had to go. Not because she asked me to leave. Not because anything dramatic occurred. No confrontation. No confession that backfired. No moment of decision that turned into disaster. Just the slow, grinding realization that I could not keep sitting 3 desks away from her in the open plan office, could not keep watching her talk to other people and feeling this catastrophic, disorganized ache in the center of my chest, and also not do anything about it. It was too much to carry. It was too much to carry alone, which is the only way I knew how to carry things. So I left. I submitted my resignation on a Thursday. I didn't tell her in person. I told myself it was because there was nothing to say. Nothing had happened after all. And that was true, technically, and also a complete lie. I drove to the airport at 5 a.m. I bought a blueberry muffin. I moved to Portland to forget her. Portland in November is gray in a very specific way. Not the threatening gray of a storm, but the quiet gray of a city that has accepted its weather the way old houses accept their creaking floors. It just is. The sky is low and soft, and everything is slightly damp, and after 2 weeks of it I stopped noticing, which I think was the point. I found an apartment in a neighborhood called Selwood, on the 2nd floor of a converted Victorian, with windows that looked out onto a street lined with maple trees that were losing their last leaves in slow, indifferent spirals. The floors did creak. The radiator made a sound like a kettle that couldn't quite commit. There was a bakery 2 blocks away that opened at 6:30 and smelled like cardamom and warm bread, and I started going there every morning not because I was hungry, but because I needed something to do with the first hour of the day, before my brain started generating thoughts I didn't want to have. I was managing, is the word I used. Managing. I found a job remotely, something in project coordination, unrelated to my previous work, with a team spread across 3 time zones that I would never meet in person. I liked that about it. I liked that my colleagues were voices on a screen and typed messages with no context and had no opinions about me except that I sent my updates on time. I went to bed at 10. I woke at 6. I went to the bakery. I came home. I worked. I made dinner from recipes I found online, foods I'd never cooked before. Not because I was reinventing myself, but because the process of following instructions kept my hands busy and my mind occupied with something concrete. This many grams of flour, this temperature, this amount of time. Time was the thing I was working on. The theory was that time would do what distance alone couldn't. That if I put enough of it between myself and the feeling would thin out, become manageable, eventually become something I could fold up and put away in a drawer and stop thinking about. That's how grief works. Or so I'd been told. I'm not sure I was grieving the right thing, but I was applying the method. It worked mostly. For 5 weeks it worked mostly. And then I went to see a therapist. And the method stopped working completely. I need to explain why I decided to go to therapy in the first place. Because it wasn't the obvious reason. I wasn't in crisis, wasn't falling apart, wasn't unable to function. I was functioning fine. I was managing. The reason I went was a Tuesday night in December, 8 weeks after I arrived in Portland, when I was lying in bed doing that thing I had gotten very skilled at not doing, remembering. And I suddenly couldn't remember the exact sound of her laugh. I could remember everything else. I could remember the angle of the late afternoon light in her office. Could remember the specific pause she had before she answered a question she found interesting. Could remember the texture of her coat hanging over the back of her chair. Could remember 17 separate moments when our hands came close to each other and neither of us moved. But the laugh, the actual acoustic reality of it, the sound, had started to blur. It was there but imprecise, like a photograph left too long in the sun. I felt the loss of it in my chest like a dropped stone, and I thought, this is not healthy. The fact that I am lying here mourning the deteriorating fidelity of a memory of a laugh that belonged to a woman who was never mine is not healthy. This is not what managing looks like. I need to talk to someone. I asked the internet for therapists in Portland who had openings in December, which is a terrible time to look for therapists because everyone who made it to December without falling apart is suddenly ready to admit they need help, and therapists have no availability until February. But I found one. A practice near the waterfront that had a cancellation slot, a therapist I'd never heard of, a name I read quickly and didn't hold. Dr. Ligi. I didn't even think about the name. I just clicked the button to book the appointment. The office was on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like old wood and something slightly floral. Not perfume, more like dried flowers, the kind you'd find in a grandmother's house. There was a waiting room with 4 chairs and a table with magazines that nobody had touched in months. A white noise machine outside the door that was doing its best. I sat in one of the 4 chairs for 11 minutes. And then the door opened. I looked up, and I felt the floor do that thing it had done outside a hotel room in August. That sudden, disorienting sense of the ground becoming unreliable beneath my feet. She wasn't Renata. I need to say that clearly, because that's not what this story is. She wasn't the same person, wasn't the same face, didn't carry herself the same way. She was entirely herself and nobody else. But the voice, when she said my name, when she said Lays, with that slight upward inflection, that small questioning warmth that made a single syllable feel like an opening. The voice landed somewhere in me before I was ready for it. Like a key finding a lock I didn't know I had. Low and calm and unhurried, with just enough warmth to make the unhurriedness feel like care rather than coldness. And the eyes. I know that sounds like the kind of thing people say when they're writing a story about something they can't explain. I know it sounds constructed. But I sat in that chair, and she stood in that doorway, and her eyes were the kind of eyes that see people. Not in an intimidating way. Not in the way that makes you feel exposed or catalogued. In the way that makes you understand, in the space of a single second, that you are being registered as a full and complicated person, and that this person who is looking at you is prepared to receive whatever version of you shows up. I had not been looked at like that in 4 months. I had not been looked at like that maybe ever. Not since August. Not since a hotel door and a look that lasted 3 seconds too long. She smiled, Professionally, carefully, with the specific warmth of someone who understands that first impressions in a therapeutic context carry a lot of weight and is being intentional about what she communicates, and said, "Come on in." I stood up. I walked through the door. And I thought, this is fine. This is absolutely fine. She has a similar voice. That's a coincidence. That's nothing. This is fine. I sat across from her in a chair that was slightly too comfortable for what I was about to do. She asked me what brought me in, and I said, I moved cities to forget someone, and I'm not sure it's working. And she looked at me with those eyes and said, that's a good place to start. And I thought, I am in so much trouble. But I didn't say that out loud. I said almost nothing. I managed. I kept my voice level, and my face arranged, and my story clean. The professional version, the version without texture or embarrassment, the version that made me sound like someone who had made a reasonable decision under difficult circumstances. She listened without interrupting. She had very still hands. She held a notepad but barely wrote in it, and I wondered what that meant, whether she was trying to make me feel less observed, or whether she simply remembered things. I suspected she remembered things. When I finished the professional version of the story, she asked me one question. Not about the job, not about the move, not about the city I'd left, or the practical logistics of starting over. She asked, what was the part that felt most impossible to stay for? I didn't answer immediately. I looked at the window. There was a rain-streaked pane behind her, and the gray Portland afternoon was pressing gently against it. And I thought about 8 words in a hotel corridor, and I said, the not knowing. She nodded slowly. The not knowing what? She asked. Whether it was just me, I said. And then I stopped. Because I hadn't meant to say that. Because that was not the professional version. She didn't press. She let the sentence sit where I'd left it, gave it room to be unfinished, and moved on with something lighter, something procedural, logistics, frequency of sessions, how she worked. But I felt the shape of what I'd almost said still hanging in the room, still taking up air. I drove home through the rain. I sat in my apartment with the lights off for 20 minutes. I thought, it's just a voice. It's just eyes. It's just a person doing her job with genuine skill. It's a coincidence and nothing more. And the reason it landed so hard is because I arrived in this office already carrying something heavy, and the weight found the nearest available surface. That's what I told myself. I was very convincing. For about 2.5 days, I was completely convinced. And then Thursday came, and I had another session, and I drove back to that building that smelled like dried flowers, and I sat in the waiting room for 11 minutes, and the door opened. And she said, Lays. And my name in her voice did the exact same thing it had done the first time. I thought, oh no. There are things you learn, over the course of several weeks of weekly therapy sessions, about a person who is professionally trained not to give you information about themselves. You learn the small things. The way she holds her coffee mug with both hands when the room is cold. Mornings in January in Portland are genuinely cold, and she doesn't apologize for having a mug on her desk. And there's something about that lack of apology that I find myself thinking about later, in the grocery store, for no reason I want to examine. The fact that she has a specific pen she uses for session notes, dark blue, which she clicks exactly once at the beginning and once at the end of every session, as if it's a small ritual of opening and closing. The way she laughs, quietly, to herself, almost inward, when I say something that's both sad and precise at the same time, as if she's registering the accuracy of it, as if accuracy in pain gives her something to recognize and honor. I learned to notice these things. I tried very hard to stop noticing them. I tried to notice them less. It didn't work. Here's what happened, session by session, week by week, through January and into February. I came in carrying the story I'd prepared to tell her, and she asked one question I hadn't prepared for. And the story I'd prepared dissolved, and something truer came out instead. Every time. Without fail. It was almost mechanical. The precision of her questions, the way they found the seams in whatever I'd built, and gently, without drama, pressed on exactly the right place. By the 5th session, I had told her things I'd never said out loud to anyone. Not about Renata, not the center of it, not the hotel corridor, not the 4 minutes outside my door, but adjacent things. The way I'd felt, at 31, that I had been living inside a life that fit me the way a coat fits when it's not quite the right size. Close enough, warm enough, but slightly wrong, in ways you can only name when you're wearing it in bad weather. The way I'd always moved toward people with a kind of breathless caution, always braced for something, always slightly behind the curve of whatever was happening. The way the most terrifying conversations were the ones I never had, the ones I let calcify inside my chest rather than speak aloud, because speaking aloud meant they were real, and real things could fail in ways that imaginary ones couldn't. She didn't analyze these revelations immediately. She held them. She repeated things back to me in her own words, slightly differently, slightly from an angle I hadn't considered, and asked how it sounded from over there. I kept saying, yes. That's accurate. That's more accurate than the way I said it. And she'd nod and say, what does it feel like to have someone else name it? And I'd say something careful and professional sounding, and I would be lying. Because the honest answer, the answer I composed in my head every single time and never said, was, it feels like being seen by someone who isn't afraid of what they see. It feels like a hand finding mine in the dark. It feels like something I've been hungry for so long I stopped identifying it as hunger. But you don't say that to your therapist. You especially don't say that to your therapist when the reason you're in therapy in the first place is that you moved cities to escape a feeling that had found you anyway and is now sitting across from you wearing a different face, clicking a blue pen at the beginning and end of every session. I was aware of the irony. I was exquisitely, painfully aware of the irony. And here is the thing about irony when you're living inside it. It doesn't make the feeling smaller. If anything, it makes it more pronounced. Because now you're feeling the thing, and simultaneously performing the meta-awareness of feeling the thing, and neither layer of that performance makes you feel any better, and you still have to drive home through the rain afterward and cook something from a recipe and make yourself sleep. February was the hardest month. In February, I started doing something I cannot entirely explain, which was constructing reasons to think about her that weren't the obvious reason. I started thinking about the way she'd framed a question 3 sessions ago. Not because the question had unlocked something therapeutic, but because I wanted to be inside the memory of her voice for a few more seconds. I started noticing, in conversations with other people, when someone said something that she would find interesting, and filing it away involuntarily, as if there were a version of reality in which I would tell her. Not in the context of a session, but just tell her, the way you tell someone you're thinking of when you see a thing they'd like. I started having thoughts that began with the phrase, she would. She would understand that. She would laugh at that. She would have an opinion about that book, that article, that particular kind of rainy afternoon. I recognized this pattern. I had lived inside this pattern before. Last August, 3 desks away from someone I wasn't allowed to feel the things I was feeling. My chest did its stone-dropping thing. I sat across from her on a Tuesday in February, the first cold, clear day we'd had in weeks, the kind of Portland afternoon where the sky breaks open and everything goes golden and sharp for about 40 minutes before the gray comes back, and she asked me how I was doing with the distance. Not the geographic distance, the internal one. The distance between who I was before I left and who I was becoming in the process of arriving somewhere new. I said I thought I was getting better at it. She tilted her head slightly, just enough, and said, better at the distance, or better at not feeling the thing the distance was supposed to help you not feel. I looked at her. She looked back, and something in that look, the steadiness of it, the complete lack of judgment, the quality of presence that I had been quietly accumulating evidence of for 2 months, broke through something I had been keeping very carefully sealed. I said, "I don't know that those are different things." She said, "I think you do know." Silence. The radiator in her office made a small sound. Outside the window, the brief gold of the afternoon was starting to soften back into gray. "I think," I said slowly, "that there's something I haven't told you." She waited. "Not because I'm trying to hide it," I said, "because I keep not finding the right words." "What shape does it have?" she asked. "You don't need the words. Tell me what shape it has." I thought about that for a long time. "It has the shape," I said, "of a door I keep walking past. That's always slightly open. And every time I walk past it, I decide not to look in." She nodded. "Why not?" "Because," I said, "I'm afraid of what's on the other side." She waited again, and I had the strangest feeling, not threatening, not uncomfortable, just very real, that she already knew what was on the other side of the door, that she had known for several weeks, that she was not asking because she needed the information, but because she was waiting for me to be ready to give it. I didn't give it. Not that day. I went home and I stood at my kitchen window and watched the last of the afternoon light fall out of the Portland sky. And I thought about the door I had described. And I thought about what was behind it. And I thought, at what point does the decision not to look become its own kind of lie? I called my sister that night. She lives in São Paulo, 9 hours and a world away, and we talk every 2 weeks about things that are adjacent to important, without usually being important themselves. She asked how Portland was. I said it was cold but good. She asked how the therapy was going. I said it was helpful. She said, "You sound different." I said, "Different how?" She said, "I don't know. Less sealed." I didn't say anything. She said, "That's a good thing, Lays. I think that's a good thing." I said, "Yeah, probably." After we hung up, I sat on the floor of my apartment, not dramatically, just because the floor was there and the chair was too far. And I thought about the word sealed, about how it had felt, for a very long time, to be a person who kept things very carefully contained, who moved through the world in a way that looked like composure, and was actually something closer to preemptive management, who had learned, early, that if you never let things out all the way, they couldn't do as much damage when they inevitably moved. I thought about how the first time I felt something crack open in me was the first time I heard a laugh through 2 glass walls, and how the second time was a Tuesday in February, in a room that smelled like dried flowers, and how maybe sealed wasn't the same thing as safe. There was a night, a Thursday, mid-February, when I came in and she noticed immediately that I had not slept. She didn't say so directly. She just asked, after the first 5 minutes of session, if I'd had a difficult week. I said I hadn't slept well. She asked why. I said I didn't know. She waited in that way she had. That patient, unhurried waiting that always made me feel like I had more time than I actually needed. And I said, "I've been thinking about something you said, a few sessions ago, about how the most protected places in us are often not the ones we keep locked, but the ones we keep just slightly open, just open enough that we can always say it wasn't closed." She was quiet for a moment. "What about it?" she asked. "I think I have one of those," I said. "I think I have a place that I've kept just slightly open my whole life, because I was more afraid of what would happen if I fully closed it than of what would happen if I fully opened it. And I think I've been circling it for a long time. And I think coming here, coming to Portland, coming to therapy, coming to these sessions, I think it's been circling me back." She looked at me with those eyes. "Are you ready to look at it?" she asked. I don't know, I said. Are you going to tell me what I'll find? She shook her head gently. That's not how this works. But I'll be here while you look. I'll be here while you look. I drove home slowly that night. I made tea I didn't drink. I sat in the dark of my apartment for a long time, not thinking or trying not to think, which is a type of thinking. And something moved in me. Not dramatically, not like a wall coming down, but like a window opening in a room that's been shut for a long time. Just a crack. Just enough to change the air. I thought about Renata. I thought about her laugh. And then, for the first time, I thought, that wasn't just a job. That wasn't just a professional complication. That wasn't just a feeling I was supposed to not have. That was something real. And something real in me had responded to something real in her. And I had moved a city away from it rather than learn its name. And here, in Portland, in a room that smelled like dried flowers, something was asking me, gently, persistently, without ultimatum, to learn its name. It wasn't Renata's name. It was mine. What I felt. Who I felt it for. The specific way a particular kind of seeing, a particular kind of voice, a particular quality of presence did something to me that I had never quite had a category for, because I had always filed it somewhere safe before it could accumulate into something too large to ignore. I sat in the dark for a long time, and I thought, oh, and then I thought, of course. And then I thought, very quietly, very privately, in a way I immediately tried to take back, of course it's her. Not of course it's Dr. Liegi, not in any way I would permit myself to act on, not in any way that was anything other than the complicated overflow of an already full heart finding the nearest available surface. Not in any way that wasn't, at least partly, a recognition of something in myself that had been trying to surface for years, and that her presence had made it impossible to ignore any longer. But of course it was her. Of course it was someone whose voice made the air different. Of course it was someone who looked at me and was not afraid of what she saw. Of course it was someone who waited. I had spent 31 years moving toward people who were certain, and it had never felt like this. And I had spent 31 years calling this feeling something else. Admiration, respect, closeness, complicated fondness. Because it was easier and safer and required no action. I thought, I need to tell her. Not everything. Not the impossible parts. But something. I thought, I need to walk through the door. But before we go on, if you've made it this far, it's because this story touched something you already know. That feeling you can't quite name but recognize the moment it arrives. The way we move through our whole lives sometimes, building the most careful architecture around the one thing we most need to look at. So hit the like button right now. It's the easiest thing you'll do today, and it's what helps me keep bringing stories like this one to you. And if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now and hit the bell. YouTube will let you know the moment a new story drops here on the channel. Now tell me in the comments. Have you ever moved, physically, emotionally, metaphorically, to get away from something that turned out to have moved with you? Have you ever discovered that the thing you were running from wasn't outside you at all? Tell me. I read every single comment. And tell me, what city are you watching from? I'll put a heart on everyone. Now, back to our story. The session after that Thursday, a Tuesday, again, the first Tuesday of March, with pale sunlight doing something tentative and hopeful through the rain-streaked window. I came in, and I did not have a story prepared. I sat down in the chair that was slightly too comfortable, and I looked at her and I said, I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me say all of it before you respond. Because I've been building up to this for several weeks, and if I stop before I finish, I don't think I'll start again. She set down her pen. She did not click it. She just looked at me, steady, her hands resting quietly in her lap, and said, I'm listening. I took a breath. When I came here, I said, I told you I moved cities to forget someone. That was true. What I didn't tell you, what I've been not telling you, what I've been circling around for 2 months, is what I was actually forgetting. It wasn't just a person. It wasn't just a situation that was professionally complicated or emotionally inconvenient. I was running from a feeling. A specific feeling that I'd been having in some form or another for a very long time, that I didn't have a name for, or that I had names for but kept choosing the wrong ones. She waited. I moved here, I continued. And I made an appointment with a therapist because I thought I needed help getting over something. And the first thing that happened when I walked into this office was that the thing I was trying to get over, the specific quality of it, the way it lived in a voice and in the way someone looks at you, it was here, in this room. Not because you are her. You're not her. You're entirely yourself, I know that. I've known it from the beginning. But because the thing I was running from isn't actually about her. It's about me. It's about what I recognize when a certain kind of person looks at me a certain way, and the terror of admitting what that recognition is. My voice was very level. I was proud of how level it was. I've spent my whole adult life, I said, falling toward women who see me, and immediately building a very good reason for why what I feel isn't what it is, and then moving, geographically or emotionally or both. And I moved here to do it again. Not to heal, actually. To be somewhere new enough that I could do the same thing in a different city and not notice it was a pattern. Silence. The pale sunlight in the window moved slightly. A cloud, or just the morning burning through. I'm noticing it's a pattern, I said. She looked at me for a moment, not with surprise, not with anything that suggested this was new information for her, with that specific quality of attention she had that I had never found a better word for than present. Lays, she said, and my name in her voice it was the same as it always was. Warm, steady. A key finding a lock. How does it feel to have said that? I thought about it. Like the floor is still there, I said. I expected it to drop, but it's still there. She almost smiled. Not quite. But something moved in her expression. Something small and certain. It usually is, she said. I'm not trying to make this about you, I said quickly. I want to be very clear about that. I understand what this space is and what it isn't. I'm not confused about that. I know, she said simply. I just needed to say the real version, I said. Not the version that keeps all the useful details vague. I know, she said again. And then very quietly, she said, and how does it feel? The recognition you're describing. The thing you feel when someone sees you a certain way. How does it feel? I opened my mouth to give her the careful answer. The examined, processed, therapeutically useful answer. And what came out instead was, like finally. I heard the word land. I looked at my hands. Like finally. I said again, quieter. Like something that's been almost true my whole life and just keeps almost being true, and then I find a way to make it not quite true, because almost true is manageable, and true isn't. She was very still. And if it were just true, she asked, then I'd have to decide what to do with it, I said. And that's frightening. That's terrifying, I said, because what I'd have to do with it it's not complicated exactly, but it requires me to be a different person than the one I've been practicing being. Who have you been practicing being? She asked. Someone who moves, I said. There was a long silence. Outside, a car went past on the wet street below. The pale sunlight was more committed now, more gold than pale, landing in a stripe across the floor between my chair and hers. "What would the other person do?" she asked. "The one you haven't been practicing." I looked at the stripe of sunlight on the floor. "Stay," I said. One word. She didn't respond immediately. She let it be there, in the room, with us, without rushing toward resolution. The sunlight moved very slightly on the floor. Somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed. "I think," she said finally, "that we've done important work today." Her voice was careful, professional, warm but boundaried in the way that I had come to understand was not coldness, but competence. The specific skill of holding space without filling it, of being present without being what she wasn't allowed to be. "I know," I said. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Lighter," I said. "Terrifyingly lighter." She nodded. That's usually what happens when we stop carrying something alone. I drove home through streets that were bright and wet at the same time, the way Portland streets get after rain clears in March. The light was everywhere, bouncing off puddles and windshields and the windows of the coffee shops I passed. Everything slightly sharp and slightly unreal, the way things get when you've been holding your breath for a long time, and suddenly you breathe. I didn't think about what I'd said. I let it exist, complete, without editing. That was new. I made soup that night, a simple one, just vegetables, something my mother used to make in the winter when I was small. I stood at the stove and stirred it and listened to the sound of it, and I thought about staying. Not about Liegi. Not in any way I could act on. Not in any way that wasn't firmly and necessarily on the other side of a door that needed to stay closed. But about the idea of staying. Of what it would mean to be the kind of person who stays in a feeling long enough to know its name instead of packing 2 suitcases and moving 14 hours away at 5 in the morning. I thought, what would I name it? And I thought, I think I know. I think I've always known. I think the distance between knowing and saying was the only distance I'd never managed to cross. The sessions continued. Something had changed, not dramatically, not in the cinematic way that doesn't actually happen in real life, but in the quiet, incremental way that is the only way real things actually change. I started talking differently, less about Renata as a problem to be managed, and more about her as a person I had genuinely cared for, in a way that had been real and unresolved and human. I started talking about the pattern, the long, careful history of almost, the geography of feelings I had never let arrive. I talked about being 11 and confused, about being 19, and certain there was something different about me but not yet sure how to hold it in language. About being 26, and in a relationship that was kind and comfortable, and quietly incorrect in ways I hadn't had the courage to name. Liegi listened. She asked questions. She was very good at her job. And I was doing the thing I had been afraid to do. I was staying. In the city. In the feeling. In the room. In the truth of who I was, and what I had spent years almost being. One afternoon, a Thursday in late March, with real spring starting to arrive in Portland the way it does, sudden, tentative, a little overwhelmed by itself, she said something that I carried with me for days. She said, "You described yourself earlier as someone who moves, but looking at the past 3 months, what I see is someone who stayed." I started to disagree. She shook her head gently. "You stayed in Portland. You stayed in this room every week. You stayed with the uncomfortable questions. You stayed long enough to say the true thing." A pause. "You've been staying, Lays. You just haven't given yourself credit for it." I didn't say anything. She said, "What does it feel like to hear that?" I said, "Like someone describing a person I'm not sure I recognize yet." "That's all right," she said. "Recognition takes time." That evening I walked home instead of driving. It was about 30 minutes, through streets where the cherry trees were doing something improbable and beautiful, the pink of the blossoms against the gray-white sky. I walked slowly. I let the air in. I passed a coffee shop where two women were sitting at a window table, talking with that unguarded ease that comes from long intimacy, finishing each other's sentences without trying to, laughing at something that came from between them and not outside. I slowed down as I passed. I didn't feel sad. That surprised me. I felt possible. I felt like someone who was, very slowly, learning to move toward herself instead of away. I reached my apartment and stood outside for a moment, looking up at my window. Second floor. The light I'd left on. The curtain I'd bought at a thrift store and never quite hung straight. This small, slightly imperfect life I'd been building in a city that had nothing to do with me, except that I'd chosen it. And that choice was as much a self-revelation as anything I'd said in that room. I went inside. I made tea. I sat at my kitchen table, and I thought, clearly and without panic, for the first time in a long time, about what I wanted. Not what I was allowed to want. Not what made sense to want. What I actually, fully, without the editorial committee, wanted. I wanted to stop almost feeling things. I wanted to stop living in the slight crack of the door and finally push it open. I wanted to stay. There were 3 more sessions in March. Each one went somewhere I hadn't planned. That was normal now. Normal in the way that things become normal when you stop fighting them. When you stop arriving with a curated version and start arriving with whatever actually happened that week. One session, I talked about my mother. About the specific silences in our house growing up. The unasked questions. The things that were obvious but never said. About how I'd learned very early that some things were permitted and some things required a careful architecture of vagueness, and how that architecture had eventually become the building I lived in. One session, I said, out loud, in a full sentence, for the first time, the true thing, the categorizing word, the name for the thing I'd been building careful alternate names for since I was 19. She received it the way she received everything, without theater, without commentary on the revelation itself, with a quiet acknowledgement that moved immediately into what it meant for me rather than what it was. I cried a little after, not dramatically, just the way things come out when they've been held for a long time and finally have enough room. She passed me the tissue box without comment. I blew my nose. She said, "How do you feel?" I said, "Embarrassingly okay." She said, "Why embarrassingly?" I said, "Because I expected more damage." She said, "Sometimes the damage is in the keeping, not the knowing." I went home, and I looked in the mirror for a while, which is something I rarely did. And I didn't look for problems or confirm fears. I just looked. I thought, "Hello." I thought, "There you are." April arrived. Portland in April is something else entirely. Not the tentative hope of late March, but a full, committed green. Everything growing at once, like the city had made a decision and stuck to it. The bakery 2 blocks away put tables outside for the first time. The maple trees on my street were fully leafed. The mornings were light in a different way. Not the flat gray light of winter, but something that came from a specific angle and hit the buildings in a way that made them look like they were being seen clearly. I started running in the mornings. Not because I was becoming someone who runs. I am not categorically someone who runs. But because I needed something to do with the energy that was building in me now. The energy of a person who has stopped carrying something sideways and is learning to set it down properly. I sent an email to my sister that I hadn't planned to send, on a Wednesday morning before my run, that said, "I'm okay. I think I might actually be okay. I think this was the right thing to do, even though the reasons I did it were wrong. I think Portland is teaching me something. I'll explain more when I can." She responded in 11 minutes. Lays. I've been waiting. Tell me everything. I didn't tell her everything. But I told her more than I usually do. That alone was a kind of staying. And there was a Tuesday in April. Warm, actually warm. The kind of afternoon where you could wear a light jacket instead of the serious winter coat and feel like you'd earned it. When I walked into the building that smelled like dried flowers and rode the elevator to the 3rd floor and sat in the waiting room, and for the first time in 4 months of coming here every week, I wasn't braced. I wasn't managing. I was just here. The white noise machine hummed outside the door. The magazines were still untouched. Someone in another office was laughing at something. A real laugh, uncontained. The door opened. "Lays," she said. And the sound of my name in her voice did what it always did, landed somewhere in me, warm and quiet and certain. And I didn't try to manage it or categorize it or file it somewhere safe. I just let it be what it was. Evidence of a particular kind of sensitivity in me, a real and specific response to being seen, that I was finally allowing to exist without requiring it to mean something else. I stood up. I walked through the door. I sat down. She looked at me, and something in the looking was slightly different. Or maybe it was that I was slightly different, and that's what changed the quality of the looking. "You seem different today," she said. "I feel different," I said. "I feel like I've finally caught up to myself." She tilted her head. "What does that mean?" I thought about it. "I was always a few steps behind who I was," I said. Like the feeling would arrive first, and I'd spend months running after it, trying to catch it before it did damage, trying to manage what it meant. And today I walked in here, and the feeling was where I was. They were in the same place. She looked at me for a moment. "That's significant," she said. "I know," I said. "How did you get there?" I smiled, just slightly, just enough. I stopped moving. The last session of April was a Thursday. Portland was at peak spring, the kind of afternoon that doesn't apologize for being beautiful, with sunlight landing in wide, unhurried stripes across the floor of the room, the window behind her fully illuminated for the first time since November. It looked like a different room. It was the same room. I don't remember how the session started. I remember how it ended. We had been talking about forward motion, not as escape this time, but as genuine direction. About what I was building in Portland, which was more than I'd noticed. A job I was good at and starting to like. A neighborhood that had become navigable in the specific way that means you've started to belong to it. The bakery at 6:30, the maple trees, the mornings that were getting longer and lighter and less like something to survive. At some point near the end of the session, she asked me about Portland itself. Not therapeutically, just, I think, because we were near the end of things and there was room for something lighter. She asked what had surprised me most about the city. I said, the way it's so consistently itself. It doesn't pretend to be something warmer or easier than it is. But it's not cold. It's just honest about its weather. She considered that. "I've always thought so too," she said. I looked at her. I hadn't known she was from here, or had lived here long enough to have an opinion about its character. She didn't offer context. But something in the small, unguarded way she said it, "I've always thought so too," was different from the careful precision of a therapeutic response. It was just a person, agreeing about a city. I felt, very briefly, the outline of her as a whole person who existed outside this room. I didn't press it. I didn't need to. We reached the end of the session. She did the thing she always did. A slight shift in her posture, a glance at the time, a gentle indication that we were arriving at the threshold. She said something about scheduling, about the next week, about the work we'd been doing. And then she picked up her pen. She clicked it once. I was already standing, gathering my coat from the arm of the chair, and something made me stop. Not a word, not a plan, just a pause, The way things pause sometimes when they're aware they're about to be over. She looked up. I looked at her. The sunlight from the window was very direct, very April, and it caught the edge of her face in a way that I saw completely. The stillness she carried, the attention that never left, the quality of presence I had been accumulating evidence of for 5 months without allowing myself to call it what it was. I didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. I think she understood. Not in a way that needed to be addressed. Not in a way that required any action or acknowledgement inside this room, this space that was what it was, and not something else. But in the way that people understand each other sometimes when they've been paying close enough attention for long enough. When the vocabulary of gestures and pauses and the specific silences between words has had enough time to develop its own grammar. She looked at me. I looked back. And there was something in her eyes. Something I will not try to name exactly, because naming it exactly would do it the wrong kind of justice. That was clear. That was unhurried. That was, I think, the same quality of recognition I had been sitting with for 5 months, in a different register, looked at from the other side of the room. I know what I saw. I know that I'm allowed to know what I saw without having to do anything about it. I smiled. Small. Quiet. The kind that doesn't need to be explained. She looked at me for one more moment. And then she said, "Same time next week?" And I said, "Yes." And that was it. That was it, and it was also everything. I put on my coat. I picked up my bag. I walked through the door. I walked through the waiting room, past the untouched magazines, past the white noise machine that was still doing its faithful, unhurried job. I pressed the elevator button. I rode down. I walked through the lobby and out into the April afternoon, which was genuinely warm now, and smelled like the city had finally thawed. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment. I wasn't braced. I wasn't managing. I wasn't running through any architecture in my mind. I was just standing in the sunlight. There's a small thing that happened after, which is not a nothing thing. I started, in the weeks that followed, going to a coffee shop near the building. Not the bakery. A different one. One that had opened recently and made the specific kind of cortado I liked. I started going after sessions, before driving home, sitting at the window table for 20 minutes with my coffee and not doing anything in particular. Not reading, not working. Just sitting in the window and watching the street go by and being inside my own life without the running commentary. One afternoon in May, I was sitting there and a woman walked past on the sidewalk. Not her, not Liegi, just a stranger in a green jacket. And she was talking on the phone and laughing at something, and her laugh was full and unhurried and entirely her own. I watched her go by. I felt something warm and simple in my chest. Not ache, not longing, not the complicated freight of wanting something I couldn't have. Just warmth. The specific, uncomplicated warmth of a person who has stopped fighting something and discovered that the thing, once accepted, is smaller and lighter and less catastrophic than the fighting was. I sipped my cortado. I looked out at Portland in May, which was genuinely, unambiguously beautiful. The kind of beautiful that doesn't need you to do anything about it. That just is. That just goes on being without requiring a response. I thought about Renata, warmly, without damage, with the honest, proportionate grief of something real that had happened and mattered and was over, not because it was resolved exactly, but because it had been finally, fully named, and naming things is sometimes how you set them down. I thought about the hotel door. The 4 minutes. I thought, that was real. And I thought, and it was incomplete. And I thought, and I know now, finally, what it was. And none of those things are the same as tragic. I thought about Liegi, about a look at the end of an April afternoon, with sunlight in the window. About the way, same time next week, had not needed to mean nothing. I thought about staying, about how I had quietly, in a city I'd come to for the wrong reasons, found myself doing the one thing I'd spent my whole life avoiding. I had stayed long enough to be known. That's not nothing. That is not nothing at all. I didn't find what I came to Portland looking for. I found something else. I found that moving isn't the opposite of feeling. It's just a longer route to the same place. I found that the things we carry don't lighten with distance. They lighten when we stop pretending they're not there. I found that the bravest thing I ever did was not packing 2 suitcases and driving to the airport at 5 a.m. The bravest thing I ever did was sitting in a chair once a week and saying the true version out loud to someone who knew how to listen. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, the universe has a sense of irony that is almost kind. You run from a feeling, and the feeling finds you a room with good light and a blue pen and someone who looks at you without flinching, and you stay. If this story touched you, write quietly in the comments. That's how I'll know you made it to the end with me. And if you want to keep going, if you want more stories that live in the in-between, in the almost said and the finally known, the next one is right there on your screen. A big hug. And until the next story, my loves. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description.